Picture a professor staring at a spreadsheet late at night. The numbers aren't adding up. 20 years of published research, her life's work, and when other labs try to reproduce it. Silence. A decade ago, psychology faced its darkest hour. Landmark studies, the foundations of textbooks, couldn't be reproduced. Critics declared the field broken, perhaps beyond repair. But this isn't a story about failure. It's about what happens when an entire scientific discipline looks at its own reflection and decides to change. In 2015, a study rocked the scientific world. Researchers tried to replicate 100 psychology experiments published in top journals. The success rate? Barely 39%. Headlines were brutal. Psychology's credibility crisis. Is social science actually scientific? The field's reputation seemed to collapse overnight. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of denial, instead of excuses, psychologists did something rare for any institution. They admitted the problem was real, and they got to work fixing it. To understand the fix, you need to understand what broke. For decades, academic psychology operated on perverse incentives. Surprising findings got published. Boring replications did not. This created a dangerous pattern. Researchers were rewarded for finding effects, not for finding truth. If your study showed nothing interesting, it simply vanished into a file drawer. Sample sizes were often tiny, 50 participants, sometimes 20. These studies were essentially powered by statistical hope rather than mathematical rigor. And then there was p-hacking. Researchers could analyze data multiple ways until something, anything, crossed the magical threshold of statistical significance. It wasn't fraud. It was motivated reasoning with spreadsheets. The 2011 Diederik Stapel scandal was the match that lit the fuse. A prominent Dutch social psychologist admitted to fabricating data across dozens of published studies. Stapel's fraud touched more than 50 papers. But the deeper problem wasn't the fraud itself. It was that no one had noticed for years because no one was replicating his work. In 2015, the Open Science Collaboration published their landmark paper in Science. They had systematically attempted to reproduce 100 psychology studies from top journals. The results were devastating. Only 39% of effects could be replicated. Effect sizes, when found, were typically half as strong as originally reported. The media reaction was predictable and harsh. Psychology became the poster child for everything wrong with modern science. Late-night comedians made jokes. Funding agencies asked hard questions. But here's what the headlines missed. Something unusual was happening in psychology departments across the world. Instead of circling the wagons, researchers started asking, how do we fix this? Over the next decade, the field undertook unprecedented self-examination. Researchers analyzed more than 240,000 empirical psychology articles published between 2004 and 2024. The findings showed remarkable change. Studies began reporting markedly stronger p-values across every subdiscipline of psychology: cognitive, social, developmental, clinical. One of the most telling indicators: barely significant results. Those p-values sitting right at 0.05 have plummeted across every subdiscipline. Why does this matter? Those barely significant results were often the product of p-hacking, tweaking analyses until you stumbled across the magic number. Their decline signals cleaner methods. Sample sizes tell another part of the story. Median sample sizes in social psychology have surged from 80 to 100 participants a decade ago to approximately 250 today. Larger samples aren't just about prestige. They provide statistical power, the ability to detect real effects and, crucially, to reveal when effects aren't actually there. But perhaps the most important reform wasn't about numbers at all. It was about timing. When exactly do you decide what you're looking for? Enter preregistration. Before collecting any data, researchers publicly declare their hypotheses, methods, and analysis plans. This simple act removes opportunities for post-hoc rationalization. The impact has been dramatic. When researchers pre-registered their studies, other labs were able to replicate 86% of results, compared to 30 to 70% in traditional approaches. That's not a marginal improvement. That's the difference between a science that mostly doesn't work and a science that mostly does. Almost 90% replication from barely 40. What makes preregistration so powerful? It solves the hindsight problem. After you see your data, 1,000 explanations seem obvious. But before the data? You have to commit. Articles reporting strong p-values below 0.01 are now more often published in top journals and receive more citations than studies with weaker evidence. The incentive structure has shifted. Once, a surprising finding with shaky statistics might make your career. Now, rigorous methods are becoming the path to recognition. According to Nature Communications Psychology, the field's response illustrates genuine self-correction mechanisms, researchers embarking on a collective effort to strengthen the foundations of psychological science. This matters beyond psychology. Every scientific field faces similar pressures: publish or perish, chase novelty, ignore replications. Psychology became a cautionary tale, then an instruction manual. Other fields have begun adopting psychology's reforms. Medicine has expanded pre-registration requirements. Economics has launched major replication initiatives. The crisis became a case study in institutional change. But let's not oversimplify. The reforms haven't been without criticism. Some worry that the emphasis on large confirmatory studies is squeezing out exploratory research, the messy creative work that generates new ideas. There's also the question of reach. Have these reforms penetrated smaller institutions, international labs, clinical practice? The evidence is strongest at elite research universities. And some classic findings that failed to replicate may still be true under specific conditions. Context matters. A study that works with college students in Oregon might genuinely differ from one with adults in Tokyo. The analysis of 240,000 articles shows improvement, but not perfection. The field has gotten demonstrably better. It hasn't become foolproof. Science has never been about certainty. It's about reducing uncertainty systematically. What psychology's crisis and recovery show is that the scientific method can work when institutions let it. So what does this mean for you? When you encounter psychology research in news articles, books, conversations, you now have better tools for evaluation. First, check the date. Research published before 2015 operated under different incentive structures. This doesn't mean it's wrong, but it warrants more skepticism. Second, look for pre-registration. Studies that locked in their methods before collecting data replicate far more reliably. Many journals now indicate this status clearly. Third, notice sample sizes. A study with 50 participants might suggest something interesting. A study with 500 participants that finds the same thing gives you much more confidence. Beyond evaluating individual studies, this story offers a broader lesson. We often assume that established institutions resist change. Psychology shows they can choose differently. When confronted with evidence of failure, psychology didn't deny or deflect. It implemented structural reforms, pre-registration requirements, larger sample mandates, changed incentives for what gets published. This matters because knowledge is fragile. We depend on institutions, universities, journals, professional societies to get it right. When they fail, correcting course requires both individual courage and collective will. If you're finding this useful, consider subscribing. We explore stories like this every week, cases where the data changes how we understand human behavior and the systems that study it. The replication crisis began with a scandal, one dishonest researcher fabricating data, but it revealed a systemic problem that honest researchers had unknowingly perpetuated. Bad incentives corrupt good people. When careers depend on publishing surprising findings, motivated reasoning becomes almost inevitable. The system selected for exactly the wrong outcomes. What psychology did differently was acknowledge this. The problem wasn't bad apples. It was a barrel that spoiled whatever you put into it, so they redesigned the barrel. Large sample, pre-registered studies now replicate at nearly 90%. That's the headline number, but what it represents is harder to quantify. A professional culture that changed its values. Graduate students now learn pre-registration as standard practice. The question, "What's your sample size calculation?" has become routine rather than annoying. Method sections have grown longer and more transparent. This isn't just about psychology anymore. The story has become a template. How do you take an institution that has drifted into dysfunction and steer it back? The answer, it turns out, involves both transparency and accountability. Pre-registration is essentially a commitment device. You can't move the goalposts if everyone can see where you planted them. Larger samples are a form of intellectual insurance. You invest more resources upfront to protect against false conclusions. The trade-off is worth it. And changing what gets rewarded changes what gets done. When journals started valuing replications, researchers started running them. When funders required pre-registration, it became standard. Psychology's crisis forced a reckoning. But the reckoning produced something valuable, a field that is demonstrably more reliable than it was a decade ago. The next time someone tells you that institutions can't change, that incentives are too entrenched, that professional cultures resist reform, remember this story. Psychology broke in public, and in public it fixed itself. That's not a scandal. That's science working exactly as it should. I'm the Psychology of People. Thanks for listening.